Okay, scholars, so what do you think? Are crime rates on the increase? Have they stayed about the same? Or are they on a decrease over the last couple of decades or so? If you watch the news very much, or you pay attention to uh, current events, through social media and things of that nature, you might feel that crime rates are increasing, that it's becoming an increasingly dangerous world. And I would say that the reality is that crime rates have been on a nice, slow, steady decline for the last 20 years plus. There are a couple of exceptions, of course. Chicago has been experiencing some gang warfare in the last 4 years or so. And so they've had some very high homicide rates. But even though the homicide rates are much higher than they have been in Chicago for quite some time over the last 4 years, they're still not the highest that they were compared to like the early 60s. But they are certainly higher than most other large metropolitan areas in the U.S. right now. So in general, we can say that crime rates have actually been on a nice slow decline over the last 20 years. Now, recently we know that there have been a number of protests over police brutality and the use of police force, and so that may in a couple of years when those crime statistics become available, that might indicate a blip there where we had a sharp increase for a period of time. But in general, crime rates, not just property crime rates, but also violent crime rates, have been coming down nicely, slowly but steadily over the last couple of decades. So it's a safer world today than it was 25, 30, 40 years ago. But that doesn't mean that it's still completely safe out there. We know that there are there are certain communities and certain areas of communities where that social disorganization that I mentioned earlier is really prevalent, and the crime rates tend to be higher in those areas. But generally speaking, Americans today are certainly safer than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Now, having said that, we're talking about crime rates and actual crime numbers, have been on the decline. But if you're one of those individuals who has been victimized by crime, it still has tremendous impact on you. Even though overall we're safer, the people who are impacted by crime still have the same kinds of impacts that they experienced 20 or 30 years ago. So I'm not trying to minimize the danger and the impact of crime on our communities and our society. It still is an important thing that we need to be aware of. But the reality is that crime is on the decline, and society is much safer today than it was certainly in the 1960s and even up through the 1970s and 80s. We've seen declining crime rates over the last couple of decades. Okay. So thank you for thinking along with me on that, and we're going to look at some data here in a little while that'll kind of reemphasize that. So we talked about the conflict perspective, and we talked about how the focus tends to be on what we call street crimes versus white-collar crimes. And the feminist perspective is going to look at crime and say, well, wait a minute, look at how men and women are treated differently by the criminal justice system. And women are less likely to be accused of crimes, but there are certain kinds of crimes that they're more likely to be involved in than other crimes. Women are more likely to be involved in property crimes than violent crimes, although there has been a modest increase in female involvement in violent crimes over the last few decades, relative to men's involvement. So even though it used to be pretty rare to see women involved in violent crimes, it's becoming less shocking and less rare. for women to be involved in violent crimes. When a violent crime is committed, we're less surprised if it's a woman that committed it today than we would have been in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. So the women's movement has not only given women lots of opportunities in the legitimate opportunity structure, but it may have also encouraged women to, to use misbehavior in times when in the past they might not have considered that. But anyway, so women's involvement in criminal activity is increasing slowly, but overall crimes are on the way down. We've seen overall decreases in crime, but women have seen their involvement increase slightly. Okay. Also, we want to point out that feminist researchers would point out that, the courts used to look at women as the victims most often, and they would look at, well, if a young lady is engaging in juvenile delinquency, then we need to do something to try to protect her from these corrupting men who are corrupting her and getting her involved in criminal activity. I think today there is more of an understanding that women can be the perpetrators of crime and can be the masterminds at times. It's not always, when a woman's involved in a criminal activity that she's been corrupted by the males around her. But, in the past, that was kind of the perspective that judges had. So they were looking at kind of a paternalistic role with female offenders. But there are certain kinds of activities that women are more likely to engage in. Shoplifting is more common among women than other kinds of crimes, for example. So, from the sociological approach, let's look at crime overall. Crime is viewed as a violation of criminal law for which some government entity or authority applies formal penalties. We have a number of different groups of crime that we want to talk about. We have what are called victimless crimes. This typically involves things that don't involve a clear-cut victim. If somebody's gambling, or if they're using illegal drugs, or they're hiring prostitutes, we would often categorize those as victimless crimes. But I would say that's really probably a little bit of a misnomer to call that a victimless crime. I think society is the victim, and I think if we're talking about prostitution, then certainly the women may be victims in that situation, particularly if it's a case of human trafficking where someone is forced into prostitution or feels that they can't get out of that. So even though we might use this category of victimless crimes to denote those crimes, I would suggest to you to think a little bit deeper and ask yourself, are there victims here? Even though there's not a clear-cut victim, if somebody's gambling, I think it harms society overall. If somebody's gambling away their mortgage check, they can't send in the mortgage payment because they gambled too much and lost too much, and now their family becomes homeless, or their family is no longer intact because of dad's gambling problem, then certainly there are some victims there. It's just not as easy to see when you've got other kinds of crimes where there's a clear-cut perpetrator and victim. Okay. There's also the category of what we call professional criminals, and these are people who make their living. They see their job as being involved in criminal activity. So the professional art thief, the professional safecracker, people like that would fit into this category of professional criminals. There's also organized crime, and this is kind of similar to professional criminals in that these individuals see their job as, to be involved in criminal activities, but because it's organized crime, we're talking about people conspiring together in an organized crime family. We think about The Sopranos and that's a fictionalized account, but there is some reality that those programs are based on in terms of, a syndicate or a crime family controlling a lot of the criminal activities that occur in a particular neighborhood or community. And those crime families have been supplanted by new generations. So when somebody gets involved in organized crime, they're doing it, to try to achieve some upward mobility, some financial success. They've lacked legitimate opportunities, perhaps, and they get involved in organized crime. Over a generation or two or three generations, that family may, have subsequent generations getting involved, but eventually, and if we think about The Sopranos, Tony Soprano did not want his son Anthony or his daughter involved in those activities, so he was paying for college, and he was sending his kids to college to get an education so that they could become lawyers or whatever, but not to be members of an organized crime family. So a lot of times that does happen in organized crime. You see families that get their start in upward mobility through organized crime, but the prospect of having the FBI kick your door down and perhaps going to prison for RICO charges for years and years and losing everything you own is a constant threat to people in organized crime families. And so there is encouragement to start businesses that may initially just be ways of hiding the money that's being earned through illegal activities, but eventually those businesses can become successful. And eventually, organized crime families might move into legitimate business opportunities and start, moving away from organized crime. And when that happens, it creates a vacuum. It creates a place for subsequent immigrants, quite often, to move into those neighborhoods and then start to take over the organized crime. So today we might have Jamaican mafias and Russian mafias as opposed to the Italian mafia that we saw back in the Prohibition days. Okay, we call that ethnic succession. And that means that different groups are coming into the country at different times, and we know that immigrant groups really struggle to assimilate and to find legitimate opportunities due to language barriers, education and credentialing barriers, and things of that nature. So organized crime often is an opportunity for them to achieve some upward social mobility, or at least some economic stability. And so you get these new ethnic groups who immigrate to the United States, and they are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, and therefore there are few opportunities in the legitimate world, so they may resort to illegitimate opportunities. And that's what we mean by ethnic succession. As that group experiences financial success and upward mobility, they'll become less involved in crime, and that will allow other groups to come in and fill that void, okay? Because, obviously these groups are providing services that people want, whether it's drugs or prostitution or gambling opportunities or whatever. The federal legalization of gambling will probably have some negative impacts on organized crime families, because fewer people will be using bookies and gambling, illegally as a result of the ability to gamble legally now, okay? So organized crime is another category that we talked about. Then we have white collar and technology based crimes, and they are just what they sound like. People are able, through their positions in their jobs, their white collar jobs, they're able to embezzle money or to transfer money to commit crimes because of their position in society and in their organization. They're able to commit crimes that are somewhat related to their occupation. Okay. We also have hate crimes, and we know that those are criminal acts that are based on the victim's race, and so crimes where you vandalize somebody's mosque or synagogue, those acts of vandalism are hate crimes. This is a fairly new category compared to the other categories of criminal activity that are listed in our textbook and that are measured by the FBI and their uniform crime reports. But that's become a very serious category of criminal activity, and we have enhanced punishments. If you assault someone, that's against the law, and there are punishments for it. But if you assault someone because of their race, gender, religious views or any of those things, then it becomes potentially a hate crime, and it can have enhanced penalties. And unfortunately, in the current atmosphere in the United States, we've seen a sharp increase in hate crimes. And I said back in 2015 that if President Trump was elected and he kept talking the way he was talking about immigrants, both legal and illegal immigrants, in very disparaging ways, that we would see an increase in hate crimes, and that's exactly what has happened. And certainly it's not all due to President Trump's rhetoric, but certainly I think that's had an impact. Okay. And then the last category is what we call transnational crimes, and these are crimes that occur across borders of different countries. And so in some cases, there was a time when transnational crimes just involved smuggling something from one country to another country, but today, with transnational corporations and the economy, online banking and all that kind of stuff, there are transnational crimes that span many borders to many different countries. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about victimless crimes. As I said, here we're talking about crimes where there's a willing exchange of goods or services, with adults, but they are illegal goods and services. So prostitution, gambling, and drugs are all examples of victimless crimes. There are some activists who are trying to decriminalize many of these things. For example, if we decriminalize marijuana and make it the law of the land that people can possess and consume marijuana, then criminal enterprises would no longer be selling marijuana because it's a legal product. Or at least not as much marijuana, because there would be legal entities that would be selling that marijuana. As I said, professional crimes involve a person who, sees themselves, hey, this is my job. Burglary, safecracking, hijacking cargo, and shoplifting could all be examples of professional criminals. As I said, the professional art thief, those kinds of folks would fit into that category. We know what organized crime and white-collar crimes are. I'm going to move on, and now I do want to point out that when we talk about hate crimes, over half of hate crimes are based on the race, ethnicity, or nationality of the victim. About 21% are based on religious hatred. And about 20% are involved with or revolve around the sexual orientation or gender identity of the victim. And then about 1% are based on someone's disability or gender, So, but the biggest category there is race, ethnicity, or national origin. Okay. So some examples of transnational crimes: bankruptcy and insurance fraud, illegal drug trade, terrorism, counterfeiting, migrant smuggling, trafficking in human beings. Those are some examples of transnational crimes. Now, let's talk a little bit about crime statistics and some of the issues with measuring crime, why it can be a bit of a problem. Of course, we're talking about behaviors that people are trying to keep hidden, and so we know that our crime statistics are not an absolute measure. They're not a perfect measure of criminal activity because they're based on reported crimes. So there's the first problem. These acts are only, the statistics are only based on crimes that are actually reported to the police. Okay, so that's certainly one issue. The data tend to serve as indicators of police activity rather than, the absolute levels of different crimes. So, social scientists, particularly criminologists, were asked, well, okay, so how do we know that increases and decreases in crime rates have any meaning if these behaviors are not always reported? And so we decided that a number of years ago that we were going to do what we call victimization surveys, where we go back and we ask people to report on crimes that they were of which they were victims in the last, usually we say 6 months or so, okay? Because I can tell you what crimes I've been the victim of in the last 6 months, but I can't tell you, 13 months ago, 12 months ago. Now my memory starts getting a little fuzzy, so we tend to keep this to what crimes have you been the victim of in the last 6 months. And what we see is that victimization reports show us that, first of all, there's a lot of unreported crime out there. There's a great deal of crime that is not reported to police, but it gives us a little bit of confidence that our crime data does have some meaning, because the gap between the actual crimes that were reported to police and the crimes that were reported by victims, the gap stays about the same. And so when we see that crime rates are going down, we see that the victimization surveys tell us that crime rates are going down as well. And so the gap kind of stays the same. And in this case, the victimization data, and we've also supplemented that with what we call self-report studies, where we ask people, what crimes have you committed in the last 6 months? And you'd say, well, wait a minute, nobody's going to tell you about the crimes that they've committed. If we are doing this in survey form and we're not getting someone's identity, they often will tell us that they have committed various crimes. And what we find is that there are two things that have come out of the self-report data that I think are very valuable. And one is that, yes, the self-reports tend to show that crime rates are on the decline over the last couple of decades, just as our crime statistics and the victimization reports show us. And secondly, crimes are much more widely committed by people of the dominant group as well as minorities. Crime is not relegated just to minority groups. The dominant group commits about equivalent levels of crime, but they don't necessarily get charged and convicted of those crimes at the same levels. Okay, so very, very useful pieces of information, because it confirms what the official data from the FBI in their Uniform Crime Reports. You'll hear me call that the UCR, Uniform Crime Reports. That's a category of crimes that are reported by police departments to the FBI. Now, the police departments report all kinds of crimes to the police, but there are 8 crimes that are some of the more harmful and more common crimes that are committed that the UCR tends to focus on. So there are 4 crimes against people, or violent crimes. So that's going to be homicide, that's going to be rape, that's going to be robbery. Okay, so homicide, aggravated assault. Okay, that's the 4th violent crime. So we've got rape, homicide, robbery, and what did I just say? An aggravated assault. That's the big one. I keep forgetting aggravated assault, but the vast majority of violent crimes are aggravated assaults. Okay, and then for the property crimes, you've got burglary, larceny, grand theft auto, and arson. Okay, those are the 4 primary crimes that the FBI collects data on for their Uniform Crime Report for crimes against property. Okay, so when you hear people talking about crime rates, they're talking primarily about those 8 crimes. And when they're talking about violent crime, those crimes are really dominated by aggravated assault, and so that's really what they're talking about. Now, if they're talking specifically about the murder rate, then that's a little bit different, right? That's just a category out of the violent crime category. But aggravated assaults are so much more numerous than homicides that when they say that the violent crime rate is going down, most time that means that the aggravated assault rate is going down. Okay. So, yes, there are some problems with the way that we gather data on crime. It's always going to be the case when you're trying to gather data on things that people want to keep hidden and secret. But as I said, the victimization and self-report studies tend to confirm that there's a lot of accuracy, that yes, the gap is there, but it stays about the same. And so when we actually see crime rates falling, that really is linked to a decrease in overall crime rates. Okay. So if you look at Table 7-4, national crime rates and percentage change, here we're just comparing the crime rates for the UCR crimes over, I think it's a 2-decade period of time. So we've got, let me look at this, 2016 versus 2002. So about a 14-year gap between that, and what we see is a decrease in every category. For murder, we've seen a 6% decrease from 2002 to 2016. For forcible rape, 3% decrease. Robbery, 31% decrease. Aggravated assault, 7% decrease. So the total violent crimes, about an 18% decrease in violent crimes over that time. In regards to the property crimes, burglary, 5% decrease. For larceny theft, 20% decrease. Motor vehicle theft, 35% decrease. And the total property crime, 20% decrease. You see that you'll notice that arson's not there. That's because it's often very difficult to determine if a fire started, spontaneously through a wiring problem in a home or something, or a gas leak, or whether it was set. So we don't report statistics on that quite as often, because it can be hard to determine if a fire was arson or if it occurred through bad wiring or gas leak or something like that. So if you look at Figure 7-3, you'll see that the victimization rates, in other words, your relative likelihood of being the victim of a crime, has gone down from about 80 per 1,000 population down to somewhere around 20 per 1,000 population. So again, all the indicators are that crime rates have been on the decline, certainly for the last couple of decades and maybe a little bit longer. And we should feel a little safer in our homes, but when there's so many media stories about different crimes occurring all across the country and all around the world, it does sometimes create a tendency for people to be more fearful and to feel like crime is actually on the rise when it's on the decline. Okay. So there are a number of trends that we might use to try to explain this. Most sociologists did not predict this decline in crime rates, to be quite honest with you, but there are some explanations. We have seen a number of communities implement community-oriented policing and crime prevention programs, such as using technology to determine when a gunshot is fired, having these sensors that help pinpoint when crimes occur, when firearms are discharged. We've got some new gun control laws, and so those laws can sometimes help keep the firearms out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. We've locked a lot more people up, so we have a massive population of people in prison who have committed crimes, which at least prevents them from committing further crimes. New surveillance technologies, so we've got new ways of monitoring people and trying to determine if they're planning to commit various crimes and things of that nature. People are better able to put better security measures in their homes and their businesses, and so we've got better security, more security companies who will monitor alarms and things of that nature. We've seen that the crack cocaine dependency has become less prominent in our society today. So, that crack cocaine epidemic that we were going through back in the 1980s certainly posed some very serious risks. And then the aging population. We know that as we get older, more people are getting older, and therefore they're less inclined to commit criminal activities. All right, so there are a couple of slides in your PowerPoint that talk about gun control and some of the issues that we're facing as a country trying to figure out. On the one hand, I grew up as a hunter, and so I own a few shotguns and a rifle or two, but I don't own a handgun. I don't object to people owning handguns, but I do think that we ought to have more background checks. I think we ought to do more to try to ensure that people are lawfully, purchasing guns and using them in an appropriate way. We ought to have better training for people who are going to carry guns. Yes, I know that concealed handgun licenses do have some training, but I think it's probably inadequate. And we probably ought not to have as many assault rifles or guns that are categorized as assault rifles, because essentially, people who want to say that they're buying those for hunting purposes, that's really not, that's generally not an accurate representation of that. You don't hunt deer with a high capacity magazines. That's not necessary. I do believe that Americans have the right, of course, to bear arms, but at some point, I think that public safety becomes an issue, and I'm not saying that abrogates someone's right to bear arms, but I'm not sure that the founding fathers conceived of semi-automatic weapons with high-capacity magazines when they were thinking about gun ownership. So we may need to think about what policies we want to implement going forward, and how we might want to better safeguard our citizenry, our population. Gun control is a very hot button issue, and like I said, I grew up a hunter and I own guns, but I also understand that there are countries in the world that are much safer than we are from gun homicides and suicides and accidents, that have different policies and laws in place. So I'm open to anything that makes Americans safer while not seriously impacting our rights. But that's a really complex discussion to get into, and so think about those things, and think about what you think might be logical approaches to dealing with crime rates. Yes, they're on the decline, but we can't rest. We've got to continue to work hard to increase opportunities, legitimate opportunities for people. We've got to continue trying to produce a more equitable society where people have opportunities to achieve financial success and improve the lives of their family members while still remaining within the law. And so this is a really important chapter in the textbook, and I hope that you guys will enjoy it. I've enjoyed talking about it. I could probably talk for another 2 or 3 hours about crime, but I suspect that you guys are getting tired of it at this point. So I think we've covered most of what I wanted to cover. There are a few other theories of criminal behavior that if you ever take a criminology class, you'll get into some more theories that fall under these categories that go a little deeper into things. But I think that's probably a pretty good couple hours on crime rates and crime and deviance in America. So I'm working on getting those exams graded. Be patient with me, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.